On the morning of July 26, 1943, Second Lieutenant John C. Morgan climbed into the co-pilot seat of a B-17 Flying Fortress named Ruthie II and prepared for what should have been a routine mission. Routine, in this context, meant flying deep into German airspace, dropping bombs on an industrial target, and hoping to make it home with most of the crew intact. The U.S. 8th Air Force had been flying these missions for months, and the statistics were grim. 1 in 4 bombers didn't return. But Morgan, like thousands of other young men that summer, believed his odds were better than the numbers suggested. The target was Hanover, a major industrial center in northern Germany, bristling with anti-aircraft batteries and defended by experienced Luftwaffe fighter squadrons. It was the kind of target that made veteran crews nervous and green crews pray. Morgan's crew fell somewhere between. Experienced enough to know the dangers, young enough to believe they were invincible. What happened over Hanover that day would become one of the most extraordinary stories of courage and endurance in the entire war. For over 2 hours, with his pilot dead beside him, his oxygen cut off, and his aircraft under constant attack, Morgan would fly Ruthie II with one hand while holding a corpse off the controls with the other. He would do this while bleeding, suffocating, and watching his crew fight desperately to stay alive around him. By the time the crippled bomber limped back to England, Morgan had saved 9 men through sheer refusal to quit. His actions that day would earn him the Medal of Honor and secure his place among the most celebrated bomber pilots of World War II. But the story is less about heroism in the traditional sense, and more about something darker and more desperate. About a man who simply wouldn't let himself die, and wouldn't let his crew die, even when every rational calculation said they were already dead. Into the flak. The mission briefing had been standard. Hanover lay deep in German territory, which meant a long flight over hostile airspace and extended exposure to fighters. The bomber's stream, dozens of B-17s flying in tight formation, would rely on mutual defensive fire and fighter escorts for protection. But escorts had limited range, and there would be long stretches when the bombers were on their own. The crews knew this. They'd flown missions like it before. Some had come back, some hadn't. Ruthie II lifted off from its base in England in the pre-dawn darkness, joining the formation that climbed slowly through the morning haze. Inside the cramped bomber, 10 men settled into their positions: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, and 4 gunners. They wore heated flight suits against the brutal cold at altitude, oxygen masks to breathe in the thin air, and flak jackets that might stop shrapnel but felt like wearing hope rather than armor. Morgan sat in the right seat, the co-pilot's position, monitoring instruments and assisting the pilot during the long flight toward Germany. His pilot that day was a man he'd flown with before. Competent, steady, the kind of officer who inspired confidence without saying much. The 2 men worked well together, maintaining the bomber's position in the formation as they crossed the North Sea and entered German airspace. The flak started before they reached Hanover. German anti-aircraft batteries had refined their tactics to a science, tracking the bomber formations with radar, calculating altitude and speed, then filling the sky with explosive shells timed to detonate at specific heights. The black puffs of flak appeared in clusters, each one marking a burst that sent steel fragments scything through the air. Bombers didn't dodge flak. They flew through it, maintaining formation and hoped the odds favored them. Inside Ruthie 2, the crew felt the concussions as shells burst nearby. The aircraft shuddered with each near miss. Fragments pinged off the fuselage like hail. The gunners scanned the sky for fighters, knowing the German pilots often waited until flak forced the formations to break up before attacking. Everything about the mission so far was normal, which meant terrifying but manageable. Then a shell burst directly beneath the cockpit. The explosion was catastrophic. Shrapnel tore through the thin aluminum skin, through the floor, through the instrument panel, and through the two men sitting in the pilot's seats. Morgan felt the impact, a sledgehammer blow that knocked the wind from his lungs and filled his vision with white light. When his sight cleared seconds later, he realized three things simultaneously. He was bleeding, his oxygen line had been severed, and the pilot beside him was dead. The pilot had taken the worst of the blast. Fragments had torn through his body, killing him instantly. His weight slumped forward against the control column, pushing it down and sending the B-17 into a dive. Morgan, dazed and struggling to process what had just happened, reached across and tried to pull the dead man back. But the pilot's body was limp, heavy, wedged against the controls in a way that made it impossible to move without leaving his own seat. Around him, the aircraft was dying. Instruments were shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. Electrical systems sparked and failed. The intercom that connected him to the rest of the crew was dead. He couldn't communicate, couldn't call for help, couldn't even tell them what had happened. The oxygen system, damaged in the blast, was no longer feeding his mask. At 25,000 feet, he had perhaps a minute of useful consciousness before hypoxia would render him helpless. Morgan made a decision. He grabbed the control column with his left hand and pulled, fighting to level the bomber before it fell out of formation. With his right hand, he seized the dead pilot's body and hauled it away from the controls, holding it back through sheer physical strength. Blood from his wounds, he didn't yet know how badly he was hit, ran down his arms and soaked into his flight suit. His vision began to narrow as oxygen deprivation set in. He didn't bail out. He didn't call for anyone to take over. He simply held on and kept flying. Real quick, please like and subscribe to help our channel grow. Now back to the story. The impossible choice. What followed was a nightmare measured in minutes that stretched into hours. Morgan, bleeding and suffocating, maintained control of Ruthie 2 with one hand, while using the other to keep the pilot's corpse from falling back against the controls. The physical strain was immense. Holding a dead man's weight at arm's length while simultaneously flying a damaged bomber required strength that seemed impossible to sustain. But Morgan sustained it because the alternative was death for everyone aboard. The oxygen situation was critical. At high altitude, the thin air couldn't sustain consciousness for more than a minute or two without supplemental oxygen. Morgan's severed line meant he was breathing whatever oxygen remained in his mask from the last good breath, plus whatever he could gasp from the frigid air rushing through the shattered cockpit. It should have rendered him unconscious almost immediately. That it didn't remains one of the more inexplicable aspects of the story. Some accounts suggest he managed to partially reconnect his oxygen line or find an emergency bottle. Others attribute his survival to sheer willpower overcoming physiology. Whatever the reason, Morgan remained conscious, barely. as Ruthie too continued toward the target. The formation hadn't broken up. The other bombers flew on, unaware that one of their number was being piloted by a dying man holding a corpse. Behind Morgan, in the rest of the aircraft, the crew struggled with their own catastrophes. The explosion that killed the pilot had sent fragments through other parts of the bomber. Several men were wounded, some seriously. The radio was destroyed, making communication with other aircraft impossible. The navigator, trying to reach the cockpit to see what had happened, found his way blocked by debris and damaged structure. The gunners, isolated in their positions, knew something was wrong but couldn't see what. German fighters appeared shortly after the flak subsided. Bf-109S and FW-190S, diving out of the sun, attacking in pairs and threes. The bomber formation's defensive guns fired back, filling the air with tracers. Ruthie II's gunners joined the fight, working their weapons despite wounds and damaged systems. The fighters focused on stragglers, bombers that had fallen out of formation or showed signs of damage. Ruthie II, still maintaining its position through Morgan's desperate flying, didn't present an obvious target, but the fighters attacked anyway, drawn by the smoke and visible damage. Rounds punched through the fuselage. The tail gunner called out attacks over the intercom, not knowing his transmissions weren't reaching the cockpit. The waist gunners tracked fighters through their sights and fired until their guns ran dry, then reloaded and fired again. In the ball turret beneath the aircraft, a gunner spun his cramped position to track targets, unaware that the man flying the bomber above him was doing so with one hand while holding off a dead man with the other. Morgan couldn't see much of this. His world had narrowed to the instruments in front of him, the few that still worked, and the physical sensation of the control column in his hand. He flew by feel, by instinct, by some reserve of determination that wouldn't let him quit. The pain from his wounds became background noise. The oxygen deprivation created a dreamy unreality where time stretched and compressed unpredictably. Later, he would remember very little of this period, his memory fragmented by trauma and hypoxia into disconnected images. The formation reached Hanover and began its bomb run. The bombardier in Ruthie II, unaware of the full situation in the cockpit, prepared to drop his payload. The bombs fell away, joining thousands of others tumbling toward the industrial targets below. The mission, at least in its primary objective, was a success. The formation turned for home. Morgan turned with them, still flying, still holding the pilot's body away from the controls. The return flight would take hours. He had no idea if he could last that long. The long flight home. The return flight from Hanover tested Morgan in ways that pure combat never could. The adrenaline that sustained him through the initial crisis began to fade, replaced by exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. His right arm, extended to hold the pilot's body, burned with fatigue. His left hand, gripping the control column, had gone numb. Blood loss and oxygen deprivation created a fog in his mind that made simple tasks, maintaining altitude, staying in formation, require intense concentration. The crew, gradually realizing something was catastrophically wrong in the cockpit, tried to help. The navigator and engineer made their way forward, squeezing through damaged structure and around debris. What they found was a scene from a nightmare. Morgan, covered in blood, holding a dead man with one hand while flying with the other, his oxygen mask dangling uselessly. They tried to take over, to relieve him, but Morgan either couldn't or wouldn't relinquish control. Some accounts suggest he was too far gone to process their attempts to help. Others say he understood but believed, correctly or not, that letting go even for a moment would doom them all. The aircraft's damage made normal control difficult. The hydraulics were failing. Some control surfaces responded sluggishly or not at all. Morgan had adapted to these problems through trial and error during the flight from Hanover. Anyone taking over would have to learn the bomber's new characteristics while in the air, possibly with fatal results. So he kept flying. The formation droned westward, back across Germany, heading for the relative safety of Allied airspace. Enemy fighters continued to harass them, though with less intensity, as the bombers approached the range limit where escort fighters could meet them. The attacks came in waves, a diving pass, a burst of cannon fire, then the German fighters breaking away before American gunners could track them effectively. Ruthie, too, took more hits. A fighter's burst walked across the wing, punching holes but missing anything critical. Another attack shattered the plexiglass nose, exposing the bombardier to the freezing slipstream. The aircraft accumulated damage like a boxer accumulating cuts. Nothing immediately fatal, but each wound weakening it further, bringing it closer to the point where it could no longer function. Morgan's crew fought to keep their bomber in the air. The engineer monitored fuel levels and adjusted the mixture to compensate for damaged tanks. The radio operator, his equipment destroyed, manually cranked down the landing gear later in the flight to verify it still worked. The gunners, ammunition exhausted, remained at their stations in case fighters returned. Everyone did their job despite wounds, despite fear, despite the knowledge that their pilot was dying in the cockpit and might not get them home. The formation crossed the North Sea as afternoon faded toward the evening. English coastline appeared on the horizon, a sight that normally brought relief and celebration. But for Ruthie II's crew, the hardest part was still ahead. Landing a damaged bomber under normal circumstances was dangerous. Landing one that had been flown for hours by a wounded, oxygen-deprived pilot holding a corpse seemed impossible. As they approached their base, the crew managed to partially restore communications. They informed the tower of their situation. Dead pilot, wounded co-pilot, multiple damaged systems. Emergency vehicles rolled onto the field. Ambulances waited. Crash crews stood ready. The tower cleared them for immediate landing and evacuated the traffic pattern. Morgan, by this point, was functioning on pure instinct. He guided the bomber through its approach, descended toward the runway, and somehow managed to keep the wings level as the wheels touched concrete. The landing was rough but survivable. The B-17 bounced, skidded slightly, then rolled to a stop. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft before it had fully halted. They found Morgan still in his seat, still holding the dead pilot's body, unable or unwilling to let go. Medical personnel had to physically pry his fingers from the corpse and from the controls. He'd held on for over 2 hours, flying a bomber that should have crashed, bringing home a crew that should have died. When they finally got him out of the cockpit, he collapsed. Mathematics of Courage. The Medal of Honor citation for John C. Morgan's actions that day describes extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty. It notes his refusal to abandon his crew, his physical endurance, and his skill in flying a damaged aircraft under impossible conditions. All of this is true. But the citation can't fully capture what Morgan actually did, or why it mattered beyond the simple fact of survival. Morgan saved 9 men through an act of sustained willpower that defied reasonable physical limits. The combination of blood loss, oxygen deprivation, and physical exhaustion should have rendered him unconscious within minutes. That he remained functional for hours suggests either extraordinary physiological tolerance or something else. A mental state where quitting simply wasn't available as an option. Psychologists who studied combat endurance after the war noted cases where individuals performed far beyond normal human capacity when the alternative was death for people they felt responsible for. The decision not to bail out was arguably more significant than the physical feat of flying the bomber. At several points during the flight, Morgan could have ordered the crew to abandon the aircraft. They were over Germany, but with parachutes, thus they might have survived to become prisoners of war. Many bomber crews made that choice when their aircraft became unflyable. Morgan didn't. Whether he consciously rejected the option or was simply too far gone to consider it, the result was the same. He committed himself and his crew to either flying home or dying together. This choice carried moral weight that the Medal of Honor citation doesn't fully address. By refusing to bail, Morgan made a decision for 9 other men. They lived because he kept flying, but they might have died if his strength had failed. The responsibility for that outcome rested entirely on his shoulders. That he succeeded made him a hero. But the story could easily have ended differently, with 10 bodies in a crashed bomber and a posthumous medal awarded to a man who'd tried but failed. The bomber crews of World War II understood this calculus intimately. Every mission forced choices where the line between heroism and tragedy was measured in seconds, inches, random chance. Pilots who pushed damaged aircraft home were celebrated when they succeeded and mourned when they failed. But the decision-making process was identical in both cases. Morgan succeeded, so history remembers him as a hero. How many others made similar choices and died in crashes that left no survivors to tell the story? This doesn't diminish Morgan's accomplishment. It contextualizes it. His heroism was real, his endurance remarkable, his devotion to his crew absolute. But it was also a product of a system that asked 19- and 20-year-old men to make life or death decisions for their comrades while bleeding, burning, or suffocating. The medal honored one man's extraordinary action, but that action was necessary only because of the larger insanity of strategic bombing in World War II. The price of coming home. Morgan survived his wounds, though recovery took months. The physical injuries healed, but the psychological scars proved more persistent. Like many bomber veterans, he struggled with what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He'd spent 2 hours certain he was dying, watching his crew fight for their lives, holding a dead man in his arms. Those experiences don't fade simply because you survive them. The crew of Ruthie 2 recovered as well, though some carried permanent injuries from that mission. They were reassigned to a new aircraft. Their old one, too damaged to repair, was stripped for parts. They flew more missions, faced more flak and fighters, and eventually completed their tour. Several crew members credited Morgan with saving their lives, though Morgan himself rarely spoke about the incident in detail. When pressed, he would say he'd simply done what had to be done. The Medal of Honor ceremony occurred months later, with appropriate military formality and press coverage. Morgan became one of the public faces of the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign. Evidence that American airmen possessed the courage and skill to carry the war to Germany, regardless of cost. He gave interviews, appeared at Bond rallies, and fulfilled the public relations duties that Medal of Honor recipients inherited along with their medals. But the story of July 26, 1943, took on a life independent of Morgan himself. It became a narrative used to exemplify bomber crew cohesion, the importance of never giving up, and the extraordinary things ordinary men could accomplish under pressure. The story was simplified, dramatized, and shaped into something more palatable than the reality of a man holding a corpse while suffocating at high altitude. The other crew members, the navigator who tried to help, the engineer who kept the engines running, the gunners who fought off fighters, the bombardier who completed the mission despite chaos, received less attention. This is the nature of such stories. They require heroes, and heroes require simplification. Morgan's actions were genuinely extraordinary, but they occurred within a context of collective endurance that the simplified narrative often erased. After the war, Morgan returned to civilian life and lived quietly. He rarely sought attention for his wartime service, and when asked about the Medal of Honor, he typically deflected credit to his crew. This humility was characteristic of many recipients. They understood that medals recognized moments, but wars were won through accumulated effort by thousands of people doing difficult things without recognition or reward. Legacy in aluminum and memory. The story of John C. Morgan and Ruthie II endures because it provides something people need from war stories. Evidence that courage matters, that individuals can change outcomes, that determination can overcome impossible odds. These are comforting narratives, particularly for a nation that wants to believe its wars are won through individual heroism rather than industrial capacity and strategic bombing of civilian populations. But the story also reveals darker truths about the air war over Europe. The fact that Morgan's actions were necessary, that a mission required a wounded man to fly for 2 hours holding a corpse to save his crew, reflects the brutal calculus of strategic bombing. The 8th Air Force lost thousands of bombers and tens of thousands of men in its campaign to destroy German industry. For every Morgan who brought his crew home, dozens of pilots died trying to do the same thing under similar circumstances. The B-17 itself became symbolic of this duality. It was called the Flying Fortress, marketed as a survivable bomber that could protect its crew. The reality was more complex. The B-17 could absorb tremendous damage, and often did. But it required extraordinary effort from its crews to bring damaged examples home. The aircraft's toughness became a trap, encouraging crews to press on with damage that should have forced them to abort missions. How many men died because they believed their fortress could withstand anything? Morgan's story fits into a larger pattern of World War II aviation mythology. The focus on individual achievement that obscures systemic violence. The bomber offensive killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians, destroyed cities, and achieved strategic objectives through terror as much as precision. These uncomfortable facts exist alongside stories of individual heroism like Morgan's. Both are true, Neither fully explains the other. Modern audiences encountering the story often focus on the human drama: the wounded pilot, the dead body, the desperate flight home. This is understandable. These elements are visceral and immediate in ways that strategic analysis or casualty statistics are not. But the story works only because of context. Because Morgan was flying a mission to bomb German cities. Because his pilot died in combat. Because the alternative to his heroism was 9 men dying in a crash. The Medal of Honor he received represented real courage under impossible circumstances. But it also represented a nation's need to find meaning in violence, to transform the chaos of war into narratives of heroism that justify the larger enterprise. Morgan earned his medal through actions that few could replicate. But the medal also served purposes beyond honoring one man. It validated the bombing campaign, demonstrated American resolve, and provided evidence that the terrible losses were not in vain. In the end, what remains is the image of a man who refused to quit. Not because he was superhuman, not because he didn't understand his situation, but because quitting meant his crew would die and he couldn't accept that outcome. This pure, almost primitive determination, this absolute refusal to surrender to circumstances, resonates across decades because it touches something fundamental about human resilience. John C. Morgan kept flying when every rational calculation said he should die. He held on when his body screamed for him to let go. He brought his crew home when home seemed impossibly distant. For those 2 hours over Germany and the North Sea, he became something more than human, not through supernatural ability, but through the simple, stubborn decision that he would not fail the men depending on him. That choice, that moment of refusing the easy way out, of accepting unbearable burden rather than abandoning responsibility, transcends the specific circumstances of one mission in 1943. It speaks to the capacity for endurance that exists in ordinary people when everything depends on not giving up. Morgan was extraordinary that day, but he was also just a man doing what he believed he had to do, which somehow makes the story even more remarkable. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.